My name is Victoria. I'm 32 years old, and while most daughters are planning Sunday dinners with their parents, I'm sitting across from mine in a courtroom, watching them try to sue me for every single thing I own. My phone buzzed against the mahogany wood of my desk, a harsh, vibrating insect invading the quiet sanctuary of my office. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. My stomach did that familiar, involuntarily clench, a Pavlovian response developed over 32 years of conditioning. It was the 3rd of the month. The Eleanor and Marvin Emergency Fund was due. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to rub away the fatigue brought on by 6 hours of staring at vector graphics on a high-resolution monitor. My small graphic design firm in downtown Chicago was finally turning a real profit. I had clients I loved, a team of 3 talented junior designers, and a fiancé, Mark, who actually asked me how my day was and listened to the answer. On the surface, I was Victoria the success story. Underneath, I was still Vicky, the scared kid trying to keep her parents' chaotic dinghy afloat while they actively drilled holes in the hull. I finally picked up the phone. The text message from Mom and Dad was practically vibrating with entitlement. Victoria, landlord is threatening eviction again. He hates us. Need $1,200 by EOD. Don't ignore your family. Dad's blood pressure is up because of this stress. The familiar cocktail of guilt and resentment washed over me. It was never just a request. It was always accompanied by a medical crisis or a villain who was persecuting them. For a decade, ever since I landed my first paying job, I had been their silent ATM. I paid off their maxed-out credit cards, funded sure-thing business ideas that evaporated in weeks, and covered rent on an apartment way too big for 2 people who refused to work full-time. I swiveled my chair around, looking out the window at the L train rattling past on the elevated tracks. The metal screeched against metal, matching the noise in my head. On my other monitor, a different tab was open, a savings account labeled Our Home. Mark and I were close, so close to a down payment on a modest 2-bedroom brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, a place with a real kitchen and zero drama. I looked back at the text. $1,200. That was the new sofa we needed. That was half the closing costs. If I sent it, they would be quiet for 3 weeks. Then the car would break down. Then the electric bill would be accidentally 3 months overdue. It never ended. They were drowning, and they were determined to stand on my shoulders until I drowned. My heart hammered against my ribs, a physical manifestation of breaking a lifelong rule. My thumbs hovered over the glass screen. I typed, deleted, and retyped. I can't do it this month. I don't have the extra cash. You need to call the landlord and set up a payment plan. I stared at the words. They felt alien, dangerous. Before I could lose my nerve, I hit send. I dropped the phone like it was radioactive. The silence in the office suddenly felt heavy, charged with the electricity of a bomb that had just been armed. I didn't know what the fallout would be, but I knew one thing for certain. The silence wouldn't last long. The air on the rooftop lounge was crisp, smelling of expensive gin and the faint metallic scent of the lake breeze. String lights twinkled overhead like grounded stars, casting a warm, forgiving glow over our gathered friends. This was supposed to be our night, a celebration of the engagement Mark and I had kept private for months. "You look like you're a million miles away," Mark whispered, sliding an arm around my waist. He pressed a glass of cold, bubbling Prosecco into my hand. "Stop thinking about the text, Vicky. You did the right thing. Boundaries are healthy." "I know," I said, trying to force a smile. "It just feels like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. My parents don't do no very well." "They aren't here," he reminded me, kissing my temple. "Tonight, it's just us." For an hour, I almost believed him. I laughed as my best friend told an embarrassing story about our college days. I let the bubbles of the drink numb the lingering anxiety in my chest. But then, the heavy steel door to the roof creaked open and the atmosphere shifted. I felt them before I saw them. It was a pressure in the air, a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Eleanor and Marvin marched across the deck. My mother was dressed in a flamboyant faux fur coat that screamed wealthy victim, her eyes already rimmed with well-practiced red. My father followed a step behind, his jaw set in a line of righteous indignation. They didn't look like parents coming to congratulate their daughter. They looked like a debt collection agency in human form. "Victoria!" my mother wailed, her voice cutting through the soft jazz like a serrated knife. Conversations around us died. People turned, their faces cocktails of confusion and secondhand embarrassment. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" I stepped forward, my hand trembling so hard the Prosecco sloshed over the rim of my glass. "We couldn't reach you," my father barked, his voice booming for the benefit of the crowd. "You ignore our calls. You leave us to rot in that apartment, and here you are, throwing money away on this?" He gestured vaguely at the elegant platters of hors d'oeuvres. "This is my engagement party, Dad. Please, can we talk about this tomorrow?" I begged, my voice a frantic whisper. "Oh, we'll talk," my mother said, her tears suddenly vanishing, replaced with a cold, sharp gleam. "But not with you." She stepped aside, revealing a man in a nondescript windbreaker who had been hovering in their shadow. He stepped forward and held out a thick manila envelope. "Victoria Vance?" he asked. I nodded dumbly. "You've been served." The envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds. As I pulled out the top sheet, the words "Verified Petition for Property Reclamation and Filial Support" leapt off the page. I looked up at my parents. My mother was adjusting her coat, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. "Since you want to treat us like strangers, Victoria," my father said, leaning in close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, "we'll let the court decide what we're owed. We want it all, the business, the savings, every piece of furniture we let you keep. See you in front of a judge." They turned in unison and walked out, leaving the door swinging heavily behind them. The silence they left in their wake was deafening. My engagement ring caught the light of the overhead bulbs, cold and mocking. The war had officially begun. The following week was a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee in my lawyer's office. Sarah, a woman who looked like she was carved out of granite and dressed in impeccably tailored navy wool, flipped through the lawsuit papers with a rhythmic snap, snap, snap. "Filial support is a rare play, Victoria," Sarah said, her voice a calm, low alto. "In this state, it's usually reserved for indigent parents whose children are multi-millionaires. They're swinging for the fences. They don't just want a handout, they want your entire lifestyle." "I tried to give them a way out," I said, my voice cracking. I had sent a formal settlement offer that morning, $20,000, nearly all of my personal savings, if they dropped the suit and signed a non-disclosure agreement. It was a shut-up-and-go-away payment. Sarah's phone pinged. She glanced at it, her eyebrows pulling together. Well, they just gave us their answer. She turned her laptop screen toward me. It was a Facebook post from my mother. It had already been shared 50 times. "It breaks a mother's heart," the post began, under a photo of me as a toddler. "We gave Victoria everything. We went hungry so she could have a private education. We worked 3 jobs to put her through design school. And now that she's a big success in the city, she's taking us to court to evict us from our home and leave us on the streets. Please pray for us. Success has turned our daughter's heart to stone." The comments section was a Shark Tank. "Disgusting! How can she sleep at night?" wrote my Aunt Carol, who hadn't spoken to my parents in 5 years because they owed her money too. "I always knew that girl was selfish," commented a neighbor from my childhood street. "I paid for my own school," I whispered, the words feeling small against the mountain of lies. "I worked at a diner 40 hours a week while taking 20 credits. I'm the one who paid their rent last month." "The court of public opinion doesn't care about receipts, Victoria," Sarah said, her eyes softening for a brief second. "But a court of law does. They rejected the $20,000. They think because your firm did a rebranding for a tech giant last year, you're sitting on a mountain of gold. They want a full discovery of assets. They want a list of every single thing you own." "Then let them have it," I said, a new, cold hardness settling in my chest. The guilt that had plagued me since I was a child was evaporating, replaced by a crystalline, jagged anger. If they want to play the victim, let's give them the full stage. Sarah leaned back, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. "If we go to discovery, Victoria, everything becomes public record. Their finances, too. Are you sure?" I looked at the Facebook post one last time, at the hundreds of likes from people who thought I was a monster. "I'm sure," I said. "Tell the bailiff to get his reading glasses ready. It's going to be a long list." The morning of the hearing, Chicago was draped in a miserable gray drizzle. The Daily Center towered over the plaza, a rust-colored monolith that seemed to soak up the gloom. Inside, the air was climate-controlled to a sterile, shivering chill that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up beneath my blazer. "Deep breaths, Victoria," Sarah said, checking her reflection in the glass of a trophy case. She looked like a shark in pinstripes. "They're going to try to provoke you. They want you to look like the unstable, ungrateful daughter they described on social media. Give them nothing but silence and composure." "I feel like I'm going to throw up," I admitted. My hands were ice cold. The heavy double doors to courtroom 1704 swung open, and there they were. My parents hadn't just shown up, they had staged an entrance. My mother was wearing a black veil, a literal widow's veil, despite my father standing right next to her. She leaned heavily on a wooden cane she didn't actually need, clutching a tattered Bible to her chest. My father wore his only suit, which was 3 sizes too big and smelled faintly of mothballs and resentment. When he saw me, he didn't look away. He gave me a sharp, jagged nod, as if to say, "This is your last chance to pay us to go away." I looked straight ahead. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, paneled in dark, suffocating oak. We took our seats at the mahogany tables. The silence was punctuated only by the rhythmic thump-thump of my mother's cane against the carpeted floor as she struggled to her seat. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Judge Miller was a man who looked like he had seen everything and believed none of it. He peered over his spectacles, looking first at my parents' lawyer, a local ambulance chaser named Mr. Henderson, and then at Sarah. "This is a petition for filial support and asset reclamation," Judge Miller began, his voice a dry rasp. "Mr. Henderson, your clients claim they are in a state of extreme financial destitution caused by the defendant's willful abandonment of familial obligations. They are asking for a complete inventory and transfer of 50% of the defendant's business assets, citing parental investment as the legal basis." "That is correct, Your Honor,"
Henderson squeaked, standing up. "My clients poured their life savings into Victoria's success. They are now elderly, infirm, and facing homelessness while their daughter lives in luxury. It is a matter of basic human decency and, we believe, a contractual obligation based on years of verbal agreements." My mother let out a soft, theatrical sob into a lace handkerchief. I felt Mark's hand squeeze mine under the table. I didn't look at my parents. I kept my eyes on the judge's gavel. "Miss Sarah?" the judge prompted. "Your Honor," Sarah stood, her voice cutting through the room like a laser. "We do not contest the need for an inventory. In fact, we welcome it. My client has prepared a comprehensive list of all possessions and investments shared between the parties. We ask that the court's bailiff read the verified list into the record immediately, as it contains the truth of the investment Mr. Henderson is referring to." The judge nodded to the bailiff. "Very well, let's see what we're actually talking about here." The bailiff stepped forward holding a thick stack of papers. My mother straightened her veil, a tiny triumphant smile twitching at the corner of her mouth. She thought this was the moment she'd finally get her hands on my life. She had no idea the list wasn't about what I had, it was about what they had taken.
The bailiff cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the first page of the thick packet Sarah had prepared. The following is the verified schedule of contested assets and parental investments as submitted by the defendant, Victoria Vance, the bailiff began in a dry, monotonous drone. My mother leaned forward, her eyes gleaming behind the black veil. I could see her fingers twitching against her Bible, likely already mentally spending the money she thought was coming. Item 1, the bailiff read. Reclamation of childhood savings account. The plaintiffs claim ownership of $5,000 held in trust for the defendant's education. Records show, however, that on June 14, 2010, the account was drained to zero via an ATM card held by Marvin Vance. The funds were used at the Rivers Casino. A heavy silence fell. My father's face turned a mottled, bruised shade of purple. He didn't look at the judge, he looked at his shoes. Item 2, the bailiff continued, his voice never wavering. Professional investment. The plaintiffs claim they funded the defendant's design equipment. Verified bank statements from 2015 to 2018 show a series of monthly transfers, not from the parents to the daughter, but from Victoria Vance to Eleanor Vance, totaling $45,800. These payments are labeled in the memo lines as credit card debt relief and emergency rent. The judge shifted in his seat, his gaze sharpening as it landed on my mother. She had stopped sobbing. Her jaw was tight, her posture rigid. Item 3, the bailiff intoned, flipping a page. Shared property in garage storage. The inventory includes a collection of vintage jewelry and a professional-grade camera suite. However, the defendant has provided police reports from 3 years ago reporting these exact items as stolen. Affidavits from Pawn King, Chicago confirm these items were sold by Marvin Vance for cash on the same day they went missing. "That's a lie," my father shouted, half rising from his chair. "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Judge Miller said, his voice quiet and terrifying. "The bailiff will continue. I want to hear the rest of this investment." The bailiff didn't even look up. Item 5, the Vance family heritage account. My mother's head snapped up. Her face went pale, not the paleness of her makeup, but a genuine, bloodless white. This was the secret they thought I'd never find.
This was the reason they had been so bold in suing me. For years, I had kept these secrets to protect their dignity. I had stayed silent about the gambling, the borrowed jewelry, and the thousands of dollars I had poured into a bottomless pit just to keep them from being embarrassed. Now, hearing it read aloud in the cold, hard light of a courtroom, I didn't feel guilty anymore. I felt clean. The bailiff turned another page. And finally, item 5, the Vance family heritage account. My mother's head snapped up. Her face went pale, not the paleness of her makeup, but a genuine, bloodless white. This was the secret they thought I'd never find. This was the reason they had been so bold in suing me.
The bailiff didn't skip a beat. Item 5. The Vance family heritage account. The plaintiffs claim this is a dormant family trust. However, our investigation shows this account was opened in the defendant's name without her knowledge, using her social security number when she was 19 years old. I felt Mark's grip on my hand tighten until it was almost painful. I hadn't known the full extent of this until Sarah's private investigator had finished the deep dive 2 days ago. The account currently holds $84,000, the bailiff continued, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. The records show that while the plaintiffs were claiming destitution and soliciting funds from the defendant for basic survival, they were funneling various cash settlements and unreported income into this account to shield it from the IRS and creditors. Every dollar in this account was placed there under Victoria Vance's identity, effectively making her legally liable for the taxes, while they treated it as a secret slush fund. A collective gasp rippled through the few observers in the gallery. Even their own lawyer, Mr. Henderson, looked like he wanted to crawl into his briefcase. He turned to my father, whispering frantically, "You told me you were penniless." "We were saving that for our retirement," my mother shrieked, finally breaking her silence. She stood up, the veil pushed back, revealing a face twisted with a terrifying, raw greed. "That's our money! She didn't earn a cent of it! We just used her name because the government is out to get us!" Judge Miller slammed his gavel, not once, but 3 times. The sound was like a thunderclap. "Silence!" he roared. "Sit down, Mrs. Vance, or I will have you removed and held in contempt immediately." My mother collapsed back into her chair, her chest heaving. My father looked like a ghost, his bravado completely shattered. He knew that by suing me for everything, they had accidentally opened the door to the one room they needed to keep locked. "Your Honor," Sarah said, standing with the grace of a predator, "my client has spent the better part of a decade being a safety net for people who were secretly building a fortress of lies. They claim they are entitled to half of her business because of their investment. We have just proven that their only investment was identity theft and financial abuse. We request not only a dismissal of this case, but an immediate freeze on the heritage account to satisfy the outstanding debts and legal fees my client has incurred." The judge leaned forward, his eyes burning with a cold, judicial fury. He looked at my parents as if they were something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "I have been on this bench for 22 years, Judge Miller said softly. "I have seen families fight over pennies, but I have never seen such a calculated, cynical attempt to destroy a child for the sake of a payout. Mr. Henderson, do you have any evidence to refute these documents?" Henderson stood up, looked at the stack of bank records, looked at his clients, and slowly shook his head. "No, Your Honor, I was not made aware of these specific accounts." "I bet you weren't," the judge snapped. He looked at me for the first time. His expression softened just a fraction. "Ms. Vance, I think we've heard enough of the list." The silence that followed the judge's words was thick, heavy with the weight of a decade's worth of secrets finally brought to light. I sat perfectly still,
my hands folded on the table, watching the dust motes dance in a single shaft of light cutting through the courtroom. For the first time in my life, the air didn't feel thin. I could breathe. Judge Miller didn't hesitate. He picked up his gavel, but he didn't swing it yet. He leaned over the bench, his eyes fixed on my parents. This court finds the plaintiff's claims not only meritless, but fraudulent, he said, his voice echoing off the oak panels. The evidence provided by the defense clearly outlines a pattern of financial exploitation and identity theft. I am dismissing this case with prejudice. A small, strangled sound escaped my mother's throat, a half sob, half hiss. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am granting with offense's motion to freeze the Vance family heritage account pending a full investigation by the district attorney's office for tax evasion and identity fraud. I am also ordering the plaintiffs to pay all of Victoria Vance's legal fees to be seized from the assets in that account. Thump. The gavel hit the sounding block. The sound was final, a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. We're done here, the judge said, standing and sweeping out of the room before my parents could utter a single word of protest. The courtroom exploded into a low murmur. My parents' lawyer, Mr. Henderson, was already packing his briefcase with frantic, jerky movements, refusing to look at Marvin or Eleanor. He knew he'd been played, and he knew his bill was likely never getting paid. I stood up slowly. My legs felt like lead, but my heart felt like it was floating. Mark was beside me, his hand a steady, warm pressure on my back. "Victoria," a voice croaked. I turned. My mother had stood up, her black veil pushed back to reveal a face that looked 10 years older than it had an hour ago. The victim mask was gone, replaced by a desperate, hollow look. My father stood behind her, his shoulders slumped, his bravado having evaporated into the air. "Victoria, honey, you can't let them take that account. That's our life. That's everything we have left. You're our daughter. You wouldn't let your own parents go to jail, would you?" I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the faux fur, the fake tears, and the cold calculation still simmering behind her eyes. She wasn't sorry she'd hurt me. She was sorry she'd been caught. "I didn't let them take it, Mom," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You did. When you decided that everything I had wasn't enough, you gambled with the truth, and you lost." "Vicky, please." My father stepped forward, reaching out a hand. "We don't even have a way home. Our car, the lease payment didn't go through this morning because of the freeze. Just give us a ride. We can talk about this like a family." I looked at the bus pass Sarah had tucked into my folder earlier, a just-in-case gesture that seemed prophetic now. I pulled it out and set it on the mahogany table between us. "The list is finished, Dad, and so am I." I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. I didn't look back, even when I heard my mother start to scream my name, her voice echoing through the hallowed halls of the Daily Center. The rain had turned from a drizzle into a steady, rhythmic downpour by the time Mark and I reached the street. The air was cold, but I didn't pull my blazer tighter. I let the water hit my face, feeling it wash away the stale, recycled air of the courtroom and the lingering scent of my father's cheap coffee. "You okay?" Mark asked, shielding me with a large black umbrella. "I'm more than okay," I said, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't lying to cover for someone else. I feel light. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal finality. The heritage account was indeed seized. Because the account was in my name, Sarah was able to argue that the funds should first satisfy the legal fees and the documented debts my parents owed me. The remainder was tied up in a federal investigation. My parents didn't go to jail, not yet, but they were hit with massive fines for tax evasion that would keep them in a small, government-subsidized apartment for the foreseeable future. The social media storm they had stirred up eventually backfired. Once the court transcripts were made public, the likes turned into blocks. Aunt Carol even called me, stammering an apology, which I accepted but used to set a very firm, very permanent boundary. 3 months later, the sun was shining over a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood far from the chaos of downtown. I stood in the middle of a literal empty canvas, our new living room. The walls were a soft, clean white. The floor was original hardwood that creaked just enough to feel like home. There were boxes everywhere, stacked like small monuments to a new beginning. I walked over to the front window and looked out at the small garden bed I planned to fill with hydrangeas. In my hand, I held a single piece of paper, the final statement for my old bank account. The Eleanor and Marvin Fund was officially closed. The balance was 0. Mark came up behind me, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Pizza's here, and I think I found the box with the wine glasses." "I'll be right there," I said. I took the bank statement, folded it into a small square, and tucked it into the very bottom of a box labeled trash. For years, I thought being a good daughter meant being a shield. I thought that if I took enough hits, eventually my parents would stop swinging. I was wrong. Some people don't want to be saved. They just want someone to drown with them. I looked around my quiet, peaceful home. I had lost a set of parents, but I had gained a life. And as I walked into the kitchen to join the man who actually loved me, I knew it was the best trade I had ever made.